Hello friends, welcome to my channel. Today I'll be going to discuss about promise in JavaScript. Promise is introduced in ECMAScript 2015 or ES6. If you're doing any modern day programming, whether it may be front-end or back-end using Nodejs, you must be encounter async or await keyword for doing any kind of asynchronous or non-blocking I/O operation. But today we are not going to discuss about async await primitives. Those are fundamentally based upon the core concept of promise. And before diving into the promise, let me explain how JavaScript handled this, async communication, because this was there from the beginning or day one. So the traditional model is using the callback approach. So you define a function, and in this argument you can pass like function. So if you are coming from other programming background, so it may looks little bit used to it, because inside JavaScript, function is a first class citizen. That means you can save as a variable, you can pass as a function parameter, and you can do many kind of magics what you are comfortable doing in any variable. But let's assume this is a new function, call me, and inside that you are passing another function, and inside this call me you may do any operation. Maybe you are trying to write to a file system or make a HTTP request. So depending upon the outcome of your actual intention of this call me function, eventually you want to call this function by passing the result. So this basic concept is used across doing the async programming. For this synchronous approach, this programming may not be useful why we are calling immediately, but let's assume some kind of non-blocking operation. This model is used heavily. So this callback, we are passing two arguments. This argument is a convention. There is no strict rule what to pass and what. That's why dealing with callback became very confusing. But usually in most of these standard primitives in Node.js or any other library you use, the first argument usually stands for error. This is just a convention, but there is no hard and fast rule for that. So if there is no error, you just pass a null to that, so that you can check later for the first argument. If it is null, then you can see that you got a successful response from the callback. In the second point, you can pass the data. Depending upon the function signature, you can pass any number of argument. It is up to you. And to call back this particular function, you can call me and pass this callback function here. So this callback function again take two arguments like error and data. So if there is error, you are just printing this log, or you may want to return this flow. Because in case of error, once you print this log or do some kind of error handling, you do not want to proceed further. If there is no error, you can want to do some console log data. There are different ways you can handle this. Maybe you can check this error, or you want to return it. There are different improvement you can make into this primitive call. But usually there are two problems here. One is, as I said, like the standard way to identify this error and the actual data is not standardized, or it is the compiler is not enforcing that. So there may be potential that a new programmer can do mistake. They may try to send this data over here. Then it will be make extremely difficult to do error handling, because if you are dealing with callback, there is no try catch exception. So you can't make this call me and try catch, and you can expect to handle this error in the catch block. That is not possible in a callback approach. So you have to pass this error in the first argument or second argument also, but it is a convention to use first argument. But it is a bit brittle. So it's difficult to enforce that rule. So you have to trust all the programmer will follow this whatever is convention. And second thing is that usually in the real life project, you are not going to deal with the only one particular callback function. So you may have like nested callback. You may want to read from file system. Once the data is correct, you may want to make some API call. Once API call is correct, then you want to make some database call. So there would be nested callback. So it would be very difficult to manage that kind of program where you have dealing with the nested callback. That is known as callback hell. So because of that limitation, or to come up with a better solution, this promise is introduced to make this handling of this async code bit more smooth and easier. So this promise introduce to alleviate some of the pain of the callback. But if you try to learn from the first time, it may looks a bit more confusing. That's why this async await introduced to reduce the further pain of the promise. But the promise provides the fundamental blocks which can enable this async and await to work on top of it. The promise may not sound very easy, but it is a basic concept you should master. So instead of callback function, so you can return this promise. So I have not shown the function signature where you can return, instead of calling this callback function, you can return as a sync call, like you can return a promise. Promise, once you get this result, that means that it is not that result you may not get at that moment, because that whichever the function is returning promise, that may take 1 hour or 2 hours for the execution. And once it is completed the execution, at some point of time, you may get result. The result may be success or failure. So it is a clearly defined way how you can do error handling here. So to define the promise, you have to use this create a new instance of promise. And inside that you provide a callback function. This is a function you have to pass. And this callback function is a proper standard. You can't pass any other arguments here. So it is a predefined standard function, what you need to pass it. And this callback function is again having 2 arguments, resolve and reject. And interestingly, those two also a callback function. Those are not simple variables. Those are also a function. So inside this particular promise, you can do any kind of processing or any kind of logic. If it is success, you have to call this resolve. And if it is failed, you have to call this reject with passing an argument. In this case, I am passing like string, but you are feel free to pass like array or object structure or map or any kind of complex data structure. And this resolve and reject, you can give anything name what you feel comfortable. But it is standard, or it is recommended to use resolve and reject, so that it would be more, whoever reading your code would be more comfortable. So for success, you will call resolve and pass in the data. And for the reject, you can call this reject again with the fail. You don't need to call resolve and reject in one after another. So you can put some if else condition, do some error checking, and you should handle this one. And you can assign to any variable. This P is like promise type. And also inside, once you get a promise, it is slightly confusing in the beginning. You don't have try catch block, or you cannot able to access the data directly. P dot, if you want to access the success data, how to access it? Let's say you call a function and that return a promise. Then how you handle it? Immediately you cannot access the data. At some point you will get the data. So to define at some point, like you have to call some, there are 3 functions inside promise, only 3. One is then, another one is catch, third one is finally. And inside that also you have to define a callback function. So if you see there are so many callback, it is not easy to beginning. That's why there is a async await. But to understand it is very much crucial. So inside that, then you have the callback function. So whenever this somebody calls this resolve success, in our case it is immediate. But in the real world scenario, it may be after that HTTP call or file handling once the data is written. So that resolve will be called at that moment. So whenever that resolve will be called success, so this D will be pointing to this success data. Whatever the data is passed over here. And you can print it. Or you can do any operation, whatever you like it. And if there is an exception means like somebody called reject and with some message, reject failure. Then this won't go to this then block. Then this will come to this catch block with some error. That error you can access. So then is for success. case is for failure or error message. Both won't be called at one same time. So either one of these will be called. But finally is not very commonly used. It is for some cleanup operation. In case like you are making some database connection, even though it is succeed or fail, you want to close this connection. Now there are lots of abstraction layer, but this database connection opening is a traditional computer science problem. For example, file also you want to open a file, you want to close it so that other program can access it. So that kind of closing operation, even though it is success or failure, you want to close the connection, or that kind of cleanup operation you can do in finally. So this will be called, even though this code will be executed, after this code will be executed, or this code will be executed, this would be called all the time. So if you understand this particular concept, so you are, way ahead to understanding the promises. So now let me show some example how we can create some promise, and I'll explain about various new nuances about it. Now let me show some code examples. I'll start with creating a simple callback function, then move to promise. I'll explain both success as well as failure scenario. Then I'll talk about how we can chain a particular promise, because chaining a promise is one of the very important concept to understand. And finally, I'll explain about how we can promisify a particular function written in a callback style. Maybe I'll pick an example of file handling, which is written in a callback style. Then I'll try to convert it to promising. Promise written in a promise. That would be more interesting. So now let me start it with a simple callback function. So I define a variable to store the function. I like this style, so you can write like function using I'm using a arrow syntax. You can write traditional function style as well. So I'll take this callback as an argument. This callback is a function style. So I'm using GitHub Autopilot, so it is suggesting me some code. So let us use that one. So call me function. This callback is a function signature, so that will pass as an argument. And inside that we can call this callback directly, but here I'm using a timeout. So because H2 callback usually used in case some asynchronous scenario, because the result we are not expecting immediately. So after let's say 1 second or 2 second delay, we get this result. So just to call this callback function, call me with data. We're just trying to print it. So this particular code block will be executed when this timeout expired or after 1 second. So this won't be executed immediately. If it is executed immediately, we could have called and written and stored into some variable. Usually traditional manner we could have done like let x is equal to call me and get the data, right? This is how we normally call it. But in case of callback function, we have to pass additional function, and this would be executed immediately, synchronous call. But the async call, this would be executed whenever the data or whenever this async operation is completed. The set timeout can be a file operation or a DB call or API call, so which usually takes some time. So this is how we write programming callback. Let me run it. I'm in some other directory. Let me go to the correct directory. Yeah, after 1 second delay, this hello is printed. And as I said, like to do the proper error handling, we should pass this error here. So if you write some any kind of standard code, so you should call this, like this approach. So this is the convention used by most of this Node.js module. So if it is error, we print this error, else we print this data. So this is how we do this error handling. There won't be any change of the program, but it will be this is the suggested way to do error handling. So if you want to pass some error, so any data you can pass, and if you try to call it, so this data block won't get printed. So error is going to print it. So this is the way you can do the error handling, and we can call once it's success, we can call some nested operation. Then it would be debugging, and dealing with callback would be a little bit complicated. But if you try to write the same function using promise, let me define another function, constant. So in this case, we are not going to pass any function as an input argument. So we are directly going to return it a promise. Let us write our one promise, new promise. So this is a struct or a class, so which has some different signature. This executor is the callback function, which has two arguments like resolve and reject, and both are also like different function. So once we do the reject resolve, similarly here also we can do some timeout and resolve it. So if it is success, this hello will be called. Now currently we are not doing promise. So we define a new promise here, and inside this callback function we have a timeout, and if it is successful we are resolving it. This promise will return only the success scenario. So this you can do directly return. So call me promise, instead of we are passing into argument, we are returning this promise type, right? So we could have call this function call me funcs, like this we can call it, and we can store into another variable, but we can't directly access the data after this point because this data may not be available at this moment. That is the important thing you have to understand. You can call a promise, but in a synchronous call you can get the data directly at this point, so you can deal with it. But in case of promise or callback, whichever may be the async pattern you are using, so this P you can store the promise, but the data is not available at this moment. So when the data will be available, you have to call another function like then. So this promise we can call as like then. Whenever the data is available, maybe after 2 seconds or 1 second, at that time this particular function will be called. So if you are waiting for the data to be inserted into the table, you have to write the code here. So if you are writing the code in this line, it won't work out. So this promise, this is the way it is, like this is the approach how we can call me function, and here we are doing like executing a promise. Let me execute it. Say hello from promise. And if you want to throw some exception here, instead of resolve you can do the reject. So if you do the reject and only doing then you have not implemented catch, then it will throw some exception. See, unhandled promise rejection warning. This is a runtime exception. So you should always try to avoid runtime exception. If you are using, TypeScript, so this kind of error can be caught in the compile time. But by default, by JavaScript, this you must have to implement the catch. If you not implement the catch, if there is any exception thrown in your function, then there is a runtime exception will happen. Then it would be run. You should always try to avoid runtime exception. So whenever you are dealing with, then you should always implement this, catch. Maybe you want to print that message, or you want to do the error handling differ from application to application, or depending upon the use case. But you must need to implement this catch function. Then whenever there is a reject will happen this promise, so this should be executed. Let's say let me try error from promise. Error from promise. So just to see, this is the code where it is executed. Yeah, this is also printed. So this particular line won't be executed, and catch would be executed. So it is always, whenever you are dealing with promise, you should always mention then and catch, both the thing. Even though if you don't mention catch, it won't complain. But if in case in runtime it will throw some exception or error. Let's say you are calling any file system. So if the file is not found, you may not get error if you don't define it, but it will throw a runtime error. And after then catch, you have a finally. So if you notice, then is having some input argument data, and catch having some input argument error. But finally, it doesn't contain any input argument. And this finally can be used for the cleanup operation, like closing the database connection, file handle, and so on. So once we execute it, this finally is executed. So even though you do resolve or reject, so that then block will be executed, but finally is executed. So finally code will be executed irrespective of then block is called or catch block is called. Now let me discuss about one of the very important concept of promise, that is chaining. This chaining is sometimes a bit confusing if you are beginning this promise and trying to work with this. So this is like a particular function which return a promise, and we can have like then catch and finally. So this promise can can have like endless chaining we can do. So if you whichever this call we return, this will again we return a promise type. If you see this hover around the mouse to P, this is again a promise. So this is a bit extremely confusing. So what I'm trying to say, once we get the data right, you can again do this P dot then. So we can have some data. So again, you can do catch finally and continuing that story. But once you get this promise, you can again do this then and data and console.log. In this case, this particular promise won't return any data. I'll come to that again. but this is again another then close, right? If I try to execute it, see hello from the original promise, this will be executed, this one, and this catch won't get executed, and finally will execute it at the end, and this then to from hello from promise will be executed second. So after this, then the chained one will be executed, even though we do implemented it after the finally will be implemented at the end only. So if you want, we can implement another finally. See, finally two, and so it will clean up that last one first, then the first one. This will be executed before this finally, right? So this particular the call me function, if you store this particular then and case finally to another promise, then also you can again nested it. And if you want, like, if you don't want to use any variable, so you can directly, nest using this promise directly here. That will also work fine, because if you are not trying to deal with the promise. So hello from promise finally. So here again you can do this then multiple time. You can do this any number of time. So all your then code would be get executed sequentially one after another. So first this would be executed, then this one, then this one. Once you do that, say hello for promise, then one, then two. If you notice here, both are data is printing as undefined, because inside this then block we are not returning any value or data. So if you want to return any data, so you can do some different data. You don't need to return the same data. Return data something else, like I appended a word. So you can be written anything else here. Then it will come to this data will come from this particular return statement. Say hello from promise world. And because I am not written anything here, so this is again undefined, but you can keep on returning, and the promise chain can happen. So similar to then, you can have any number of catch block as well. But catch block won't get executed as it is, because this is like a failure path. So this catch block error 1, error 2 not executed. But if we, let's say, instead of resolve, we want to reject, this is only error 1 is executed. We can define there is no problem, but it won't execute it itself. So to execute itself, so we have to explicitly throw it. Inside this catch block, if you try to explicitly throw a new error, then only this particular, then only this particular catch block will be executed. So now this error 1 will be printed, and then error 2 will be printed, because this is where we are explicitly throwing it and catching it in below. The error 1 and error 2, and we got some stack trash. If you don't want, if you need only the message, so you can just access the message body with dot message property. Error 1, hello from promise. Error 2. finally. So if you want to put a then here, this then will execute it again, right? So if you try to throw an exception here, because inside the case you are not throwing an exception, because if you, let's say you are trying to return some data, so if you catch if you're actually returning some data, then it will go to the then block. See this data, right? If you throw an exception, then you have to handle with catch. If you are not returning anything, but by default the return will be undefined, still this then block will be executed. So if you inside the catch, if you throw a new error again, like this then won't be executed. You have to catch with the catch error. But if you are returning some data, then again it won't go to catch block here, it will go to the then block. So it is slightly confusing, but this is how the chaining works. And last, I'll explain one more thing. Just quickly touch upon it. So let's say you have you define a get file function, and you have another Nodejs simple function like read file. You give the file name, and as I mentioned, like this file name wants you to read, it will return a callback, error and data. This is like the signature of read file, which is a Node.js functionality. So if it is unable to read, it will throw this error, and it will return. But if there is a data, we will return here in this data section. Because it is returning a callback function, so we are returning this new promise. You can just wrap this particular callback function using a new promise, resolve, reject, and depending upon the point here, you can reject or resolve. So instead of returning a callback function, you can return a promise, but inside the promise you wrap this defined Node.js function, and in case of error you reject it, in case of success you return the data. This is known as promisifying a older or legacy code base. And whenever you are calling this get file, you will get the promise here. So once you can use this then and catch. In then you will get this data. In a catch you will get this error. If you try to run it, so it is successful, you got the data. But if you, let's say you try to access a not existing file, you will get some error, file not found. So this is the approach. You can convert a legacy application code to a more newer syntax. Then you can use async await as well on top of this. And most of this particular kind of work is already done by Node.js file system, so you don't have to do exactly like that. But most of this function available into Node.js library is come up with the returning the promises, so you can directly use it. But under the hood, they exactly do the same pattern. So hope you learned something today. Have a good day ahead. Bye bye.